Hi, I'm Honey, and in this video, we're going to discuss how to use watercolors safely. We'll talk about toxic and non-toxic watercolors, as well as best practices so you can be as safe as possible. Let's get started. First of all, if this is a medical emergency, please pause this video and call your local emergency hotline as soon as possible. If you are in America, the number for poison control is 1-800-222-1222 or just call 911. If you're outside of America, you can call your local emergency number. If in doubt, just call them because they have the resources to get you your answer specific to your situation much faster than a general video could. They don't judge, so don't feel embarrassed. That's what they're there for. And it's better to be safe than sorry. If this has been a helpful video to you, please like my video. And if you're new to this channel, please subscribe so you can get notified of new content. Just as a disclaimer, I am not a doctor or a scientist or a lawyer, so make sure you do your own research. There's a lot of confusing information, and this is just how I understand it. If you're a regular grown-up, watercolors in tube or pan form are typically safe as long as you don't eat it, you don't drink it, and you don't inhale it. So don't do any of those things and use your common sense. Where it gets trickier is if you have pets or kids, or if you're pregnant or nursing, or if you have a medical condition and you want to be safer. Unlike other paint mediums, watercolor doesn't have a strong smell or fumes, so you don't necessarily have to work in a well-ventilated area when you're using watercolor, and that's one of the big pluses for me for watercolor because I am very sensitive to fumes and strong smells. I physically can't do oil paint or resin because of how noxious the fumes are, but I don't have any problem with watercolor. It doesn't have any fumes at all. So it's not easy to inhale watercolor by accident. The only exception would be, which is not a common scenario, but it would be if you're hand making your pigments yourself and working with it in powder form, in which case you'd want to wear a respiratory mask just to protect yourself and protect your lungs from inhaling the powder. Again, this is not a common scenario, so if you're not hand making or mixing your powdered pigments yourself, then it shouldn't be an issue. One thing that makes watercolor safer than other paint mediums is that the solvent used for watercolor is water itself. So we don't have to worry about the water because water is water. We don't have to worry about the paper because the paper is usually either cotton paper or pulp paper or mixed media paper, which is basically just paper. We don't have to worry about the brush either. Just make sure you don't put the brush in your mouth. Some artists like to use their mouth to make the brush pointy, but don't do that. You can use your fingers if you must. I personally don't like to touch the paint at all as much as possible, so I don't do that either. To shape the brush, I typically use a paper towel or just try to shape it on the edge of my cup. The main thing we need to worry about is the actual paint itself. So to repeat, don't lick your brush and don't use your mouth to make your brush pointier. If you use a supply for art, don't use it for food anymore. It's not safe to use for food anymore even if you wash it. Even if I'm using something for kids' art or crafts, I don't reuse it in the kitchen anymore. So examples of these are cups that you use for your paint water, or if you use a ceramic or porcelain plate as your palette, don't use those to serve food or drinks anymore. Another thing that I see is sometimes people wash their palettes in the dishwasher. To me, I don't think that's advisable. That to me feels like it will contaminate all your other plates and utensils and just contaminate the dishwasher in general. Another common thing I see is people accidentally drink their paint water, which is like a rite of passage for painters. I personally have never done that yet, so hopefully I won't be doing that anytime soon. But just spit the water out and don't do it on purpose. If you have kids or pets, make sure that they can't get to your paints. I have a kid, a cat, and a dog, so I have to make sure I put my paint away after every painting session. When my kid was younger, I would lock my paint in a childproof cabinet so she can't mess with it. Sometimes my kid paints with me, so I always make sure I supervise her very well and that she's not putting her hands in her mouth, and that we wash hands very well every single time, especially before eating. So let's talk about paint. I'll list all the recommended supplies in the description below. I'll recommend some brands and products from each category, but I'll also show you how to find safety information for any brand or product that you like. There are 3 main types of watercolor. If the watercolor is for a child, your best and safest bet would be getting children's watercolor. Watercolor for kids is usually non-toxic, but make sure you check that they actually say that it's non-toxic. If they don't say it's non-toxic, I just assume that it's not non-toxic. And make sure to buy from a reputable brand so that I can be confident about the safety of the material. Kids typically put their hands in their mouth, so they do get a lot of that material inside their body, so it's really important that it's safe and non-toxic. This one is by Faber-Castell. Another good brand is Prang. Another good thing about kids' watercolor is that it's usually washable as well. The con about it is that it's not gonna look as good as artist grade watercolor, obviously. My kid personally does not like children's watercolor. She is so used to the artist grade watercolor that anything else is just not vibrant enough for her. But she's only allowed to use it under my supervision, and she's an older kid, so she knows the rules. The next type of watercolor is student grade watercolor. Some brands are non-toxic. Again, you want to see the product say that it's actually non-toxic. This is the Sakura Koi watercolor field set. This is the first watercolor set that I bought, and it's student grade. A big consideration for me when I purchased this was the safety, because at the time I had a 3-year-old kid who stayed at home with me 24/7, so she was always around when I was painting. And she would always want to paint with me when I was painting, so we painted together. Now that she's older, she doesn't like to do that as much, but before I would always have to include her when I was painting. Most student grade paints are not light fast at all, so I very quickly upgraded from this set to my artist grade set, but this is what I started with. The next type of watercolor is artist grade watercolor, and this is where it gets confusing because there's a lot more to it. For kids grade watercolor and student grade watercolor, those are meant for kids or for students, so a big selling point for their products is that it's non-toxic. But for artist grade, it's usually not a big concern, so it's harder to dig for that information. If you're looking for just a quick answer as to what specific watercolor is non-toxic, I highly recommend the Daniel Smith Essentials watercolor set, plus the Daniel Smith secondary set, plus neutral tint. I'll link those in the description below, and those are the colors that I use. But if you're wondering if a specific watercolor that you already own or a watercolor that you're interested in buying is non-toxic, I'll show you how to look for that information as well. Some of the ingredients you want to avoid are cadmium, cobalt, titanium, chromium, zinc, copper, and nickel. This is not a complete list. This is just a short list of some of the ingredients you want to avoid. An exception to this is if the pigment says the word hue. When they say hue in a pigment, it means that it's not the real pigment. It's a substitute of the pigment, probably due to the expense of obtaining particular materials or as a non-toxic alternative to the real pigment. So for example, if they say cadmium red hue, that means it's not the real cadmium red. It's just a substitute of the real cadmium. This is from the Daniel Smith website, and these are 2 examples of seals that you want to look for whenever you're trying to look for non-toxic watercolors. The first is the AP seal, which stands for Approved Product. This just means that the art material is safe. The other seal you want to watch out for and that you want to avoid
is the CL seal, which means cautionary labeling. And this means that the product is not that safe and it's not allowed to be used on any children's materials. You can typically find these seals on the manufacturer's website. Sometimes you can find them on the distributor's website, but not always. So sometimes if you're shopping at Amazon.com, they might not list the seals. So in that case, you want to check the manufacturer's website and get the information directly from the manufacturer. This is also typically listed on the product itself. If you're buying paint from a smaller company, they might not have that information. So if non-toxicity is important to you, try to buy from the bigger companies that have those seals in place. The other thing that you want to look at is the MSDS, or the Material Safety Data Sheet for that particular product. This one is the Material Safety Data Sheet from Daniel Smith, and it lists their sets and it lists which ones have a hazardous ingredient in the set itself. So really the best source to find out if your material is toxic or not is the actual manufacturer. They usually have their MSDS on their website. If they don't, or you can't find the MSDS, you can usually contact their customer support and find out if that specific material is toxic or not. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found the information useful. And if you have any questions, make sure you leave it in the comments below.